People ask me sometimes what it was like out there on Orvith's moon, the gray one, the dead one, the one without a proper name on any chart I've ever seen. They ask it the way you ask about a war, carefully, because they half expect the answer to be worse than they imagined. Most of the time I tell them it was cold and I was tired and then it was over, which is true as far as it goes. What I don't tell them mostly is about the child. That part I keep. Not because it hurts to say, it does. A little, even now, but because it belongs to her first and only secondly to me. And I've never been comfortable making other people's stories into my own currency. But it's been 11 years, and there are some things that lose nothing by being told. My name is Vasquez. Myra Vasquez, though nobody has called me Myra in about 15 years of field work. It's always Vasquez or Doc, or in one memorable stretch of the Outer Threshold campaign, the stubborn one with the kit. I was a field surgeon attached to the Interstellar Medical Auxiliary, which sounds more organized than it was. We were contracted out to whoever needed trauma support in a conflict zone and could pay the rate or convince us the cause was worth the risk. I had been doing it for 11 years when the Pelithar incident happened, which is what the official record calls the attack on our medevac shuttle over Orvith's moon. 31 souls aboard, cargo of triage supplies, no military affiliation, and 3 identification beacons all properly lit and transmitting. They hit us anyway. I was in the surgical bay when the first strike came through the hull. I don't remember the crash with any clarity. What I remember is the cold, the particular, airless cold of a hull that is no longer sealed, and then light, low and gray, and coming in at a wrong angle through what used to be the forward viewport. I remember my hands were on something warm and I looked down and realized I'd been holding a pressure clamp on a patient's leg through the impact sequence without knowing it, and that the patient was dead. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I needed to get up and begin triage, and that there was nobody left to triage. I remember that the bay was tilted about 14 degrees off horizontal, and that several of my overhead supply mounts had come loose, and that my hands were steady when I checked the clamp, and found it still correctly placed, and that this steadiness was not courage, but simply the thing that happens to your body when your mind has not yet caught up to the situation. Steadiness as a lag indicator. I've seen it in patients, too. It took me the rest of that first day to understand the scope of it. The shuttle had come down in pieces across about 2 kilometers of moon surface. The piece I was in, the surgical bay, and about 12 meters of cargo hold aft of it, had stayed largely intact, and I had stayed largely intact inside it, which was either the luckiest thing that had ever happened to me or the cruelest, depending on how you looked at it. Everyone else on the manifest was scattered across the gray dust somewhere behind me. I walked some of it in the first hours because I had to, because not walking it would have been worse than walking it. The landscape was flat and gray and utterly indifferent to the scale of what had just happened on its surface. No wind, no sound. Just the thin wheeze of barely breathable atmosphere through my emergency rebreather, and the crunch of my boots on gray rock, and the long, gray silence of a moon that had never asked to be involved in any of this. I made myself move efficiently. I made myself catalog each site the way I catalog an injury, precisely, without dwelling. The shuttle's pilot section was the largest secondary piece, about 300 meters from my hull, and it was the first one I reached, and the assessment there was fast. The central debris field took longer. I moved through it with my kit and my scanner and my rebreather and the flat gray light, and at each site I did the thing I had been trained to do, which is to assess quickly and correctly and to document, and then to move to the next one. You do this because it is useful, and because it keeps you moving, and because the moment you stop moving you stop being a surgeon, and start being a person who is alone on a dead moon, and neither of those developments helps anyone. I found 4 others alive in the first sweep. 2 were already gone by the time I reached them. One lasted 6 hours. I stayed with him and did what I could, and when he was gone I walked back to the hull. The 4th was Karis, my surgical assistant. She had been in the bay with me, strapped to the secondary station, and she had come through the crash with 2 cracked ribs and a laceration above her eye that I closed that first night with the light from my emergency lamp, and hands that I had to stop and steady once before I started. Karis made it to the 3rd day. The ribs weren't what killed her. It was internal bleeding I hadn't found in time, in the thin light, without the imaging equipment I'd lost in the impact. I have thought about that many times since. I've stopped thinking I missed something and started thinking about all the ways the situation was designed to make finding it impossible, and about whether there is any meaningful distinction between those 2 framings when the outcome is the same. It doesn't help as much as you'd expect, but it's accurate, and accuracy is what I have to offer. So 2 survivors became 1. I was the one. What the moon's atmosphere had going for it was barely enough to matter. Thin, mostly inert, breathable for a human at the cost of a constant low headache and the feeling that you were working through cotton wool. Not poisonous, just insufficient. I had air. I had the emergency heating coils in the hull, which were running on the backup cell and which I had maybe 10 days of before they failed. I had my surgical kit, a triage supply locker, 2 weeks of rations and 3 weeks of water if I was careful, and a long-range distress beacon that had been damaged in the impact and was transmitting at roughly a quarter of its rated output. Whether anyone was listening was a different question. I spent my 2nd full day on the moon doing the things you do when you are the only living person in a crashed shuttle in a dead place, inventorying what I had, calculating what I needed, securing the hull breaches as well as I could with crash foam and equipment sacking, and trying not to think about the people behind me in the dust. I was unsuccessful at the last part. You can't simply choose not to think about 30 people you knew, and the harder discipline is not trying to choose, and instead just letting the thoughts come when they come and pass when they pass. I ate half rations. I drank what I needed. I made a log entry to the black box on the off chance anyone would ever retrieve it, and I kept the log entry factual and brief because I didn't have the energy for anything else. I slept for 4 hours and spent the rest of the night listening to the heating coils cycle and watching the beacon's pulse on the status panel and reminding myself, very practically, that someone would come. I found the child on the morning of the 3rd day. I was moving through the cargo hold to check the aft hatch seal. It had been groaning in a way I didn't trust, a microflex in the hull joint that I was worried would become a breach, when I heard something behind the secondary equipment rack. Not loud. It was barely anything, a shift of weight, a held breath adjusted. In 31 years of life and 11 of field surgery, you develop a particular sensitivity to the sound of a creature trying not to be heard, because that sound precedes almost everything that matters in a trauma bay. A patient who doesn't want to be seen is still a patient. I had learned not to dismiss the sound, and I had learned not to approach it with urgency, because urgency makes hiding creatures feel more hunted, and that is never the right direction. I stopped. I waited. I kept my hands visible and my voice pitched low and conversational. "I know you're there," I said. "I'm not going to move toward you. I'm going to sit down right here on this crate. I'm going to sit here for a while." I sat. The hold was cold. Not as cold as the surface, but cold enough that I was wearing everything I had and still feeling it in my knuckles. The gray light came in through 2 small breech seals I'd improvised from equipment sacking, thin and flat, the particular light of a moon that has no atmosphere worth speaking of, and reflects a sun that's very far away. Everything in the hold was the same flat gray as everything outside it. The equipment rack was about 4 meters from me. I did not look at it directly. I looked at the deck. It was probably 20 minutes before she looked out from behind the equipment rack, maybe a little longer. I didn't check my chrono because I didn't want to make any sudden movements, and also because timing it felt like the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it was, she'll come when she decides to come, and the only thing that changes when she decides is what I do in the intervening time. She was small, That's the first thing. She was very small, about the height of a 7-year-old human child, and she was crouched in the space behind the rack with her knees drawn up and her eyes, silver, both of them, the iris color of old pewter, fixed on me with an expression that I can only describe as the opposite of panic. Panic would have been readable. What she had on her face was an exhausted, careful stillness, the look of a creature that has been afraid for so long that fear has become the resting state, and she was simply waiting to see if this new element in her environment required active response or merely watchful tolerance. Her skin was ash gray, a cool, smooth gray like stone left in deep shade. She had pointed ears which curved slightly forward, and along the line of each shoulder from the base of her neck to just past the joint, there ran a thin membrane, translucent and folded close, the color of old bone. I learned later what it was, a vestigial wing structure, remnant of an ancestor species, present in all Surath children and gradually absorbed into the skeletal structure by adulthood. At that moment I catalogued it the way I catalog everything, calmly, without judgment, with the part of my brain that is always watching for physiological data. Novel anatomy is just anatomy. Everything unusual is unusual until you understand it. She was wearing what had been, at some point, a garment. Now it was a single piece of worn fabric, pale as old linen, wrapped and tied across her body in a way that suggested it had been improvised from something larger. She was holding against her chest, with both arms, a small object I couldn't identify from that distance. Something carved, dark wood or something like it, shaped roughly like a person. I didn't move. I kept my hands on my knees. I kept my voice at the same low, unhurried pitch I use for patients who are conscious but disoriented, the pitch that means, nothing is on fire, there is no urgency, we have all the time this moment needs. My name is Vasquez, I said. I don't know if you understand me, it's all right if you don't. She didn't respond, she kept watching, her eyes were very steady. I'm not going to hurt you, I said. I'm going to stay right here. You can come out when you want to, and if you never want to, that's also fine. I'll be here. I sat there for another hour before she came out from behind the rack. She moved slowly and with a great deal of care, keeping her back to the wall and her eyes on me, placing her feet deliberately on the deck plates the way someone does when they've learned to move without making sound. She didn't come to me. She went to the far corner of the hold, as far from me as the space allowed, and sat down with her back to the angle where two bulkheads met, and she stayed there. I got up slowly, went back to the surgical bay, came back with a portion of my ration and a water packet. I set them on the deck about halfway between us, not close to her, not close to me, equidistant, which seemed correct. Then I went back to my crate and sat down again and went back to looking at the deck. She watched the food for a long time before she took it. That was day 3. I spent the next 2 days trying to understand how she had survived the crash. The cargo hold had been loaded with medical supplies, sealed containers, mostly, nothing that offered any kind of shelter against the hull pressure changes of impact. What I eventually pieced together, partly through observation and partly through her own communications once we had established a rough system of those, was that she had been in the shuttle before we loaded at the last way station. She had hidden herself in the cargo, in one of the equipment bays, with what appeared to be some understanding of the crash configuration. She had wedged herself into a particular corner of the bay that had given her the most structural protection. She had done this, as far as I could determine, not by accident but by calculation. She had assessed the space, and she had chosen the safest position in it. She had been in there alone for longer than I wanted to think about before we even left the way station. She had been in there through the attack and the crash. She had been surviving, in the cold and the dark of the cargo hold, on whatever ration tablets she had been carrying in the folds of her garment. I counted the empty wrappers eventually, and there were 7, and she had been rationing them, and on water she had accessed from a cracked supply container near the aft bulkhead. The cracked container was not accidental. She had compromised it deliberately, very carefully, to get at the water without spilling it. She had been, as far as I could determine, methodically and practically keeping herself alive. Alone, in the dark, in a crashed shuttle on a dead moon. She was, at my best estimate, the equivalent of a human child of 9 or 10 years. I didn't know then what she was running from. I knew she was running, that was written in every choice she'd made, the hiding, the stillness, the careful assessment of me on that first morning. I knew it the way you know it about patients who flinch at sudden movements. This was not someone encountering fear for the first time. This was someone who had been afraid long enough that fear had become a tool, and she was using it the way a good craftsman uses a familiar instrument. Precisely, without waste. I named the communication system we developed talking, for lack of a better word, though only some of it involved words. She had language, a Surath dialect I did not speak, melodic and consonant-rich, that she produced in short, precise bursts when she wanted to convey something specific. I had Standard and a smattering of 3 other trade languages, none of which overlapped with hers in any way I could initially use. What we had, for the first several days, was gesture and patience, and a shared understanding that we were both alive and intending to remain so, which turned out to be a surprisingly solid foundation. I gave her a name to call me by because she needed something to address me with, and Vasquez was producing 3 different sounds from her that none of them resembled the word. She experimented for 2 days. I could see her trying different approximations, quietly, when she thought I wasn't watching, and settled on something that sounded approximately like var, and I accepted it with the dignity it deserved. I did not give her a name because she had one. I could hear her say it once in the 3rd day of our acquaintance, quietly, as if reassuring herself of it, a sound that had 3 syllables and a rising pitch on the last, and it wasn't mine to replace or rename. I settled on calling her in my own head the child, which sounds cold on paper but which was in practice simply accurate, and what I had always called patients whose names I didn't yet know. On the 5th day, she let me examine her. I had been watching for signs of injury from the crash, and I had seen a stiffness in the way she moved her right arm, a careful way of not extending it fully, and I had been waiting for her to be ready. I didn't push. I mentioned it once, with a gesture toward my own arm and a questioning look, and she shook her head slightly, not no, but not yet, and I left it. You can't rush that calculation. You can only make it clear that you're available when the calculation changes. When she finally held the arm out toward me, just held it out across the distance between us, palm up, with the directness of someone who has decided a thing and is doing it, I moved to her carefully and sat beside her on the deck, not touching yet, and waited until she gave me a small nod. Then I worked with the focus I bring to any patient, clean, methodical, without theatrics. I talked through what I was doing as I did it, not because she understood the words, but because silence during an examination carries its own kind of pressure, and I wanted her to have something to listen to. She had a compression fracture of the secondary joint in her arm, not her elbow, which was positioned differently than a human elbow, but the joint below it, which served a comparable function, and which had a similar enough structure that my triage splinting technique applied with minor adaptation. It had been fracturing for several days, and she had been moving through it. I splinted it with what I had, binding it off with clean surgical tape, and checked the membrane along her shoulder while I was close. It was intact, which mattered, though I wasn't certain yet of the extent to which it had physiological function beyond the vestigial. She made no sound during the procedure. When it was done, she looked at the splint for a long moment, flexing the fingers of that hand slowly, testing. Then she looked at me, and the expression on her face was not gratitude, exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement, a recognition of competence. I understood it because I had felt it myself, in others' hands, in bad moments. The particular quality of relief that comes from having your body in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing. "You're going to be all right," I said. I don't know if she understood the words, but she seemed to understand the tone because something in her shoulders changed, not relaxed exactly, but recalibrated. The held-in quality went down a fraction, settled. That night she moved from her corner of the hold to a position about 2 meters from my sleeping area. She still had her back to the wall, but 2 meters was something. I started keeping a better watch on the beacon's output and the long-range scanner on the 6th day, because I had begun to understand that we might not be alone in this part of the system. The scanner was damaged but functional at short range, and I was picking up signal traffic that didn't belong to any rescue frequency. It was disciplined, sparse, the kind of traffic a search and scan operation produces when it's trying not to announce itself. Regular pulse intervals. No call signs. No identification broadcast. Someone was looking for something out here, and they had reasons to look quietly. I spent a day and a half convincing myself it was a rescue operation looking for us. I went through the exercise honestly, because it's always worth going through, and I came out the other end without the conviction I'd been hoping for. The frequency signatures were wrong for IMA rescue. They were wrong for any civilian emergency channel I knew. I ran them against the reference library in my kit and found the match on the second pass. Consortium enforcement frequencies. I knew them because I had worked 2 stints in conflict zones where consortium units operated. They were not a military organization, technically. They operated under a series of Galactic Compact resolutions that gave them enforcement authority over a specific category of interstellar compact law. The division that used those frequencies was the Asset Recovery Bureau. The Bureau operated under a mandate that permitted it to classify, track, and their word was repatriate. Though the operational reality was somewhat different from the word, minor species individuals who had been displaced from their origin territories without documentation. In plain language, they were hunters, legal hunters with compact authority and very careful paperwork. I sat with this information for an hour before I went to the child. She was in the hold in her position near my sleeping area. The silver eyes came up when I entered. I sat on the deck a few feet from her and I didn't say anything for a moment, just let the silence be what it was, and then I said, "I want to show you something." I turned the scanner panel toward her and showed her the signal track, the blip, the bearing, the frequency notation. She looked at it for a long time. She knew what it was. I watched the knowledge of it cross her face, not surprise. The absence of surprise was the clearest part. And then she did something she hadn't done before. She put her hand over the carved figure she was holding, both hands, one over the other, covering it completely, the way you cover a flame against wind. "I know," I said. "I see them." She looked at me. "We have time," I said. "I'm working on it." This was partially true. I had some time. I was working on it. What I had to work with was my medical certification. My 11 years of field experience with interstellar compact, law as it applied to medical practice in conflict zones, the contents of my triage supply locker, and the particular, focused anger that comes from being a surgeon who has spent more than a decade keeping people alive, and is now looking at a legal mechanism designed to take a child and call it administration. The key was the medical quarantine compact of the 6th Interstellar Assembly. It was 30 years old and poorly understood by most people who weren't in the medical auxiliary, and I had, on 2 previous occasions in my career, invoked it to stop military units from entering my surgical area during active operations. It was one of the few compact articles that gave a practicing medical officer specific authority to override enforcement mandates, for the simple reason that letting enforcement units move freely through quarantine zones would have made interstellar outbreak control impossible. And that argument had been made successfully when the compact was written, and had never been successfully challenged since. The compact was clear. A practicing medical officer, in a confirmed crash or disaster zone, had the authority to declare a biological quarantine perimeter around any individual or individuals under her medical care, if she had documented reason to believe that movement of those individuals represented a risk of disease transmission or biological contamination in a non-sterile environment. The Consortium Bureau's enforcement mandate was extensive. It stopped at the edge of a declared medical quarantine. Full stop. I was going to make this child a medical quarantine. I spent 2 hours doing the paperwork. That sounds like I am reducing something to bureaucratic absurdity, but I mean it with complete seriousness. The paperwork was the surgery, and I approached it with the same care. I prepared a complete crash zone medical assessment under my IMA certification number. I documented the child's injuries, the fracture, a mild respiratory compromise consistent with extended exposure to the moon's thin atmosphere, a grade 2 nutritional deficit from her days in the cargo hold before I found her, in full clinical detail, including species-specific physiological notations that I extrapolated carefully and accurately from the SURETH medical reference files in my KITS database. I documented my assessment of her biological status as requiring medical isolation and ongoing monitoring due to potential cross-species exposure complications in a non-sterile crash environment, with risk of secondary infection transmission requiring quarantine containment. I logged a formal quarantine declaration under Compact Article 14, Section 3, with all required evidentiary attachments. Every word of it was accurate. Every finding was real. I had not fabricated a single piece of data. I had simply described the situation in the language of the compact, using the structure the compact provided to create a legal perimeter around a child who had no other perimeter. Then I transmitted it on the consortium enforcement frequency, addressed to the commanding officer of the vessel, with my IMA certification number in the header, and the compact article citations in the body, and the entire documented evidentiary record as attachment. And I signed it with the precise, unhurried firmness of a person who knows they are correct and intends to be inconvenient about it for as long as necessary. The response came in 4 hours. It was, as I had expected, hostile. The commanding officer, she didn't give me a name, only a unit designation, informed me that my quarantine declaration was procedurally irregular, that the subject of Asset Recovery Bureau Order 7740-1C was not a medical patient but a classified displaced asset under Bureau authority, and that I was to prepare the asset for transfer within 18 hours. I read the message once, then read it again. Then I responded. I told her that under Compact Article 14, Section 3, my quarantine declaration was binding for a minimum of 72 hours pending medical review, that the individual in question was my patient, currently under active treatment for documented injuries and physiological risk factors, that any attempt to enter the declared quarantine perimeter before the conclusion of the review period would constitute a violation of the Sixth Assembly Compact, and would be logged and transmitted simultaneously to the Medical Auxiliary Oversight Board, the Assembly Compact Compliance Office, and the Bureau's own Legal Standing Committee. I told her that I was prepared to discuss a review timeline after the 72-hour period had elapsed. I ended the message with my certification number and the date stamp and the specific compact articles, listed in order, that governed my authority to do exactly what I had done. Then I closed the transmitter and went to the hold. The child was in her position, watching the bulkhead. I sat down on the deck near her, not beside her but near enough, and set a water packet between us. She took it after a moment. "They're going to keep arguing," I said, "and I'm going to keep arguing back. That's what the next several days look like. What I'm doing is buying time." I paused. "Do you understand, time?" She watched me. She said something in Surath, a short phrase, 2 words with a questioning lift at the end. "I don't know how much," I said honestly, "but some enough to think." She looked at me for a long moment with the pewter eyes. Then she did something she had not done before. She leaned, very slightly, sideways so that her shoulder was almost touching my arm. She didn't look at me when she did it. She kept looking at the bulkhead. But the lean was there, the slight angle of contact, barely any weight in it, more intention than pressure. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then she straightened again and went back to watching the bulkhead. I kept very still throughout. "Yeah," I said quietly when she'd straightened. "I've got you." The 72 hours were the longest stretch of time I've spent awake for a sustained period in my adult life, and I have spent some very long stretches awake in surgical bays. The consortium commanding officer filed a challenge to my quarantine authority with the Assembly Compact Compliance Office within 12 hours of my declaration, which was the correct and entirely expected procedural response, and which I had already accounted for. The compliance office operated on a standard review cycle of 96 hours for non-emergency challenges. The challenge required my certification files to be pulled and authenticated, and my evidentiary record to be reviewed. My IMA standing was current and clean. I had been methodical about that across 11 years, the way you're methodical about the things that might be the only thing standing between a patient and a bad outcome. I filed a counter document at the 36-hour mark. I filed a second at the 60-hour mark. I flagged the child's case to the IMA Medical Ethics Board as a potential compact conflict situation, patient rights under medical compact versus enforcement mandate under bureau authority, which triggered a separate review track. Each review track was more time. I was not being obstructive for its own sake. I was being obstructive because every hour I produced was an hour in which she was alive and uncatalogued and under my care and not in a consortium transfer hold, and that calculation was worth every piece of paperwork I could produce. The child and I reached, during those 72 hours, a kind of understanding that I find difficult to describe precisely. We did not become comfortable with each other. Comfort wasn't the right word for what that moon permitted. What we became was steady. She knew where I was in the hull at any given hour. I knew where she was. We had developed a rhythm to the day. Meals at consistent times. A period in the middle of the day when she would sit near the viewport in the flat gray light, and I would work on whatever needed to be filed or documented, and a period in the evening when I would talk and she would listen, not to the words. I don't think she was following much of the words yet, but to the sound of a voice that was not alarmed. I talked about anything that required no particular emotional output, my years with the auxiliary. A city I had lived in before I left Earth, Montevideo, which had a waterfront that was genuinely extraordinary at certain times of the evening, a wide esplanade, and the river beyond it that was wide enough to feel like a sea, and the light off the water at the end of the afternoon in autumn. I talked about that at some length because it was easy to talk about and because it was true, and I noticed that she listened differently when what I was describing was a place she could not conceive of, a place without gray dust or cold hull or the knowledge of a distant scanner blip, a place where the main concerns were which bench to sit on and whether to get coffee before or after the walk. I don't know what she heard in it. I don't know what she made of waterfront or autumn or coffee. But she listened, and that was the point. The texture of real coffee, which I missed with a specificity that kept surprising me as the days went on. The taxonomy of bad field rations and which ones were least bad in which order, a subject on which I had 11 years of field-tested opinions. Whatever I could produce that kept a consistent, even tone in the hull, because what I was doing was giving her a sound to calibrate against. I was the fix point. She was triangulating from it the way you navigate from a known position. Where is the fix point? Is the fix point calm? Then I can be provisionally calm too. That is a kind of care that doesn't require shared language. It just requires showing up and not being alarmed and continuing to show up. She started answering on the second day of that stretch, not in standard in Surath in her short, precise bursts, the way she always communicated something she wanted known. I would listen carefully and try to infer meaning from the tone and the context and the things that had preceded the exchange. We were building something, word by word and gesture by gesture, that wasn't language exactly but was adjacent to it. A grammar of shared experience, shared attention. I understood in this way that the carved figure she carried was a person from her family, an elder or someone who had functioned as one, a grandmother, or the Surath equivalent of one. I understood that she had been on the move for a long time before she found our way station. Not weeks, months. I understood that she knew people were looking for her, and that she knew why, and that she had made a calculation at some point that constant movement was the only viable option, and had been executing that calculation ever since with a thoroughness that was, frankly, remarkable for someone her age, and that said things about what she'd had to learn and why. What I didn't understand, until she showed me on the third day of the 72 hours, was the mark. She had been sitting near me while I worked on a filing, closer than she usually sat. It had become a small habit in those 3 days. When I was working, she would come and sit nearby, not looking at what I was doing but present. I had come to understand it as the Surath version of wanting company without requiring interaction, which seemed like a very sensible social preference. She moved the fabric of her garment aside to show me a marking on her left shoulder below the membrane fold. It was a tattoo, or something close enough to a tattoo in function that the word served. A precise geometric symbol, intricate and deliberately formed, covering an area roughly the size of my palm. The lines were clean, even where the ink had faded slightly with age. She watched my face while I looked at it. I looked it up in the species reference files in my kit. It took me a while. The Surath files were incomplete, as the files for most small and scattered species are in a field kit database. The Surath were not a populous people. Their documentation in assembly databases was thin, maintained more by the assembly's nominal obligation to record minor species cultural data than by any particular interest in doing it thoroughly. But I found the symbol category eventually, and when I found it I sat with the information for a moment before I said anything. It was a lineage mark, not a family identifier in the ordinary sense. A specific type, reserved in Surath custom for individuals whose survival carried a meaning to the community beyond the individual. Descendants of founding lines, cultural record keepers, holders of oral archive. People whose continuation mattered to the species as a whole. The consortium's bureau categorized it differently. In their classification system, a marked Surath individual of her age and status was a protected cultural asset under a separate set of compact articles that had been written, nominally, to protect indigenous cultural heritage, but which in practice had been operationalized to justify the physical custody of individuals like her under the rubric of preservation. The people doing the preserving tended to benefit considerably from the arrangement. The individual being preserved tended to have very little say in it. I had seen similar mechanics in human history, in different vocabularies, with different paperwork. The shape was familiar. The shape of it sat in my chest like cold metal. She wasn't just running from being classified. She was running from being designated a resource, cataloged, held, managed, and kept in a way that served the Bureau's authority and the compound interests attached to it. The mark on her shoulder, the thing that made her precious to her own people, was precisely the thing that made her a target to the Bureau's operating mandate. I filed 3 more documents that day. I flagged the lineage mark in my medical record as a culturally significant physiological identifier with direct implications for patient autonomy and for competing compact protections under Assembly Cultural Heritage Articles 22 through 31. I cited the specific heritage articles the Bureau was using in its Order 7741C. I argued, in the flat, precise language of regulatory challenge, that the presence of the lineage designation created a jurisdictional conflict between the Bureau's enforcement mandate and the Assembly's own heritage compact. and that this conflict required full assembly compact arbitration before any enforcement action could legally proceed. Arbitration, under the Assembly's own procedural rules, took a minimum of 30 days from filing to first hearing. The consortium commanding officer's response to this filing was, for the first time, not immediate. There was a silence of 4 hours. When the response came, it was not hostile in tone. It was careful, measured. They had lawyers looking at my filings now, and their lawyers were finding the same jurisdictional gap I had found. And the gap was real and documented, and they knew it. They didn't leave. They held position about 2,000 kilometers out, and they waited. I told the child what I had done. I used words she didn't understand yet, but I pointed at the scanner blip and held up my hands and made the gesture I had developed for stopped, 2 flat palms, facing out, the way you stop a patient from moving before they're ready. She looked at the blip for a long time. Then she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not relief, quite. Something harder and more specific than relief. The look of someone who has been carrying a single calculation alone for a very long time. Not the fear of it, which she had accounted for, but the weight of carrying it with no one else aware of it, and has just recognized that there is now someone else in the calculation. She said 2 words in Surath. Deliberate. The second one softer than the first, like a breath let out rather than a word produced. I don't know what that means, I said, but I'll take them, whatever they were. My distress beacon was transmitting at quarter power, and I had been adjusting it daily to manage the draw on the backup cell. On the 11th day on the moon, I noticed that the signal was being actively received by something other than the consortium vessel. The bearing was different further out, a different quadrant coming in from the direction of the nearest inhabited system. I boosted the beacon to maximum output, burning the cell faster than I would have liked, and sat with the scanner and waited. The signal that came back was not IMA standard. It was something I didn't recognize on first pass, and on second pass I identified it as an IMA emergency response identifier. One of the portable transmitters the auxiliary issued to field medical officers working in areas without reliable relay infrastructure. It meant a medical officer, somewhere out in that quadrant, was actively receiving my beacon and had a transmitter that could talk back. I responded. What came back took 6 hours to arrive. Relay skipped from a station 4 systems away and was brief. Position received on approach, ETA 72 hours, do not move. I did not move. The ship that landed on the 14th day was not a standard IMA vessel. It was a Surath transit craft, small, battered, of a design I had only seen in reference database images, with engine nacelles positioned lower than human designs, and a hull that had been repaired in at least 4 places with materials that didn't quite match. It was broadcasting the IMA emergency response identifier, and had been given legal standing to approach the quarantine zone under that identifier by the IMA medical officer at the refugee processing station, who had been its source. That officer had been working with Surath displaced communities for 6 years, and had flagged the region as a watch area when a marked Surath child went missing from a transit route some months before. She had been looking. There were 2 people aboard the Surath craft. An older woman, tall by Surath measure, with the membranes faded and absorbed as the adults had them, silver hair pulled back with something that caught the flat gray light, and an expression of such sustained and weathered determination that it recognized something in my own face, and a younger man, perhaps a cousin or a kinship relation. I was never certain. They came down in a cargo shuttle from the transit craft and landed about 40 meters from the hull breach, and the older woman walked from the ramp without hurrying. I watched the child's face when the shuttle came down. She had been at the viewport, watching the approach, and I had been beside her, and the moment the shuttle's landing struts touched the gray dust, something happened in her face that I am going to have trouble describing, and so I am going to try to describe it precisely rather than well. The stillness went out of her. Not all at once and not noisily. She didn't cry. She didn't make any sound at all. But the stillness went out of her, and what came through in its place was something she had not been able to afford for a very long time, which was the expression of a child who is, for one moment, simply present in a moment, without the overhead cost of calculating the threat, without the weight of the calculation, just present. It made her look younger than she had looked in 14 days, because what I had been seeing for 14 days was the face of someone doing a great deal of invisible work, and now the work had been set down. She looked at me. I put my hand on the top of her head, carefully, the way you do when you're not certain of the gesture but you have to say something with your hands because you don't have the words for it. She let me go, I said. They came a long way. I know what it cost me to walk her to the hull breach. I'm not going to describe it in detail, because it was a private cost and not particularly useful to describe. What I'll say is that I walked her across 40 meters of gray moon dust in the thin, cold air, and the older Surath woman came forward from the shuttle and stopped a few feet away, and they looked at each other, the woman and the child, and the woman said something in Surath, low and even, a single sentence that had something of the quality of a formal declaration. The child answered, a longer reply, precise and careful. Then the child looked at the woman for a moment longer, and something passed between them that I understood as recognition without understanding any of it, and the child went to her. I stood in the dust and watched. The older woman looked at me over the child's head. She studied me with the kind of thorough, unrushed assessment of someone deciding exactly what to say. Then she spoke in standard, accented but careful, chosen. She told us about you. She couldn't have told you much, I said. We didn't share much language. No, the woman said. She told us in hours. I didn't know how to answer that, so I didn't. The woman looked at me for another moment. Then she said, you held the line. I said I had the paperwork. She made a sound that might have been the Surath version of a short, dry laugh. Then she turned back to the shuttle. The child stopped before she reached the ramp. She turned around. She was holding the carved figure against her chest with both arms, the way she always held it, and she looked back at me across the 40 meters of gray dust. She looked at me for what I would estimate as 5 or 6 seconds. Then she said something. Her voice was clear and precise in the Surath way. 2 words. The same 2 words she had said to me in the hull, on the day I told her I had stopped the blip on the scanner. I still didn't know what they meant. I raised my hand. She turned and walked up the ramp, and the shuttle closed, and it lifted on a column of cold exhaust into the flat gray sky, and I stood in the dust until it was out of scanner range. The consortium vessel withdrew within an hour of the Surath craft's departure. The arbitration filing held. The IMA rescue ship came for me 3 days later. I spent those 3 days in the hull with the beacon pulsing and the heating coils winding down to their last hours and the gray light doing what gray light does, which is sit. I ate the last of my rations. I slept more than I had in 2 weeks. I filed the final paperwork on the quarantine declaration, the jurisdictional challenge, and the evidentiary record, and I transmitted it to the compliance office with a clean summary and my certification stamp. I wrote up a full incident report on the Pelithar attack as well, on the shuttle, the crew, the beacon frequency, the approach vectors, because it needed to be written and someone had to write it, and I was the only one who had been there. That took a full day. I wrote it carefully. I didn't leave anything out that I could remember, and I remembered most of it with more clarity than I would have preferred. When it was done, I read it once and transmitted it and didn't read it again. There are documents you write once and close. The report on Karis went in there too, the clinical findings, what I had and hadn't found, the timeline. I don't know if it helped anyone. I know it was accurate. The particular satisfaction of having done a piece of work correctly is a quieter satisfaction than people expect, but a deeper one. It sits differently from pride. It's more like something resolved, the specific resolution of having done what you were there to do with what you had, even when what you had was not much. I have lived off that satisfaction in the hard stretches more than I've lived off anything else. It doesn't expire. 6 weeks after I got back to a proper station, I received a formal notice that Asset Recovery Bureau Order 7741C had been suspended pending full Assembly Compact review. 2 weeks after that, the IMA officer from the refugee station, her name was Demetriou, and she had a tone in her written communications of someone who had seen a great deal and learned not to be surprised by most of it, sent me a message informing me that the child's lineage designation had been formally entered in the Assembly Cultural Heritage Record, and that this designation, once entered, voided the Bureau's classification authority permanently. The Asset Recovery Order had no legal ground to stand on. It would be administratively closed. Demetriou said at the end of the message, "I don't know exactly what you did out there, but it held." I sent back, "Paperwork, it was all paperwork." She wrote back, "The best surgery often is." I went back to field work. There was always more field work. The outer threshold wasn't finished with itself, and the smaller conflicts that burned at any given time in the systems I was attached to had no end of requirement for someone who could stay functional in bad situations. I worked. I was good at it. I had always been good at it. It was enough, most of the time. I thought about the child a great deal in the first months. Less as time went on, not less, exactly, but differently. Not in the sharp, immediate way of something recently relinquished, but in the way you think about things that have become part of the structure of how you think, without quite becoming ordinary memory. She was there the way the cold was there when I thought about that moon, the way the gray dust was there, the way the two words I couldn't translate were there, present, carried, not resolved. 11 years, almost to the month, after the crash on Orvith's moon, the message arrived. It came through IMA channels, flagged for personal receipt, routed through 3 relay stations. The sender designation was in a script I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't open it immediately because I was in the middle of a post-operative review and my attention was elsewhere. I opened it that night, in my quarters at the station, with a cup of something that was supposed to approximate coffee and didn't. It was in Standard. The Standard was careful and precise and slightly formal in the particular way of someone who had learned a language thoroughly in adulthood and taken it seriously, drilling it down until it was clean. She said, "I am writing to you from the Surath Cultural Repository on Verath Station, where I work as a lineage documentation officer. You would not know me by my formal name, which is long. You knew me by nothing because we did not share language, but I knew you by what you did, and I have thought for a long time about how to say this in yours. You held the ground when no one else was there. I was 9 years old and I had been running for 4 months and I had used up almost everything I had, and you found me in the cold of a wrecked ship, and you did not ask what I was worth to anyone else. You asked what I needed. And then you used everything you had to keep them from taking me, and you let me go when there was someone safe to go to. I work with displaced Surath children now. There are more of them than I can tell you without it becoming a different kind of letter. I teach them the lineage marks and the old catalogs, and I file the documents that make them legally unclassifiable, the same documents you used to make me unclassifiable. And sometimes when the work is very hard, I think of you sitting on a crate in a cold hull, in a place you could not leave, choosing to be the steady thing. I do not know if you have a word in your language for what you were to me. I had one in mine. I said it to you twice. I think you understood what it meant even without the translation. Thank you. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I opened a Surath language database, a comprehensive one, maintained by a linguistics cooperative at an assembly university, not a field kit approximation, and I looked up the 2 words I had been carrying for 11 years. I looked them up, and I sat with them for a while longer. The closest standard translation, according to the database, was compound, a single Surath term with no direct equivalent in most languages, because it described something most languages apparently hadn't needed a specific word for. It meant, approximately, the one who stays when everyone else has gone and keeps the fire. I closed the letter. I finished the coffee. Outside my port window, the station lights were reflected in the dark in long fractured lines, and somewhere out past them, in a direction I couldn't point to from here with any accuracy, a gray moon sat quiet on a rock with no name on any chart I'd ever seen. I thought about a child sitting near a viewport in a flat gray light, leaning her shoulder almost against my arm, not looking at me. Yeah, I thought, I've got you. I had not been wrong about that. Even across 11 years and 3 relay stations and a translation I should have had sooner. Even now, the getting had been real. The fire had been kept. The child had become, in the fullness of time, someone who kept fire for others in the same way and for the same reason. You hold the fire because the child is cold and you are there. That's all it is, and it is everything. That's what we do.